Sometimes the days weigh more than the years. For Tomas, each morning was a meticulous repetition of inherited gestures. The lukewarm coffee served in his mother's chipped cup. The radio on low volume, as if it did not want to disturb the memories. And the slow walk of his father, Don Elias, dragging his feet down the hallway like an old ship approaching port. The house smelled of damp wood and old photographs. And although everything seemed in its place, something inside Tomas creaked. It wasn't sadness, exactly. It was more of a question that was never formulated in words, but that settled among the furniture like invisible dust. Elias spoke little. It had always been like this. But lately, that silence seemed more ... dense, as if he was hiding something. Something that had been there forever, disguised as routine, like a clock that tells the exact time. But its hands have stopped for 30 years. That morning, Tomas noticed that his father had changed the lock on the upstairs room. Nobody used that room. Nobody. Since Ijo Jowu, Elias had breakfast in silence. The toasted bread, without butter, coffee, without sugar. Out. It wasn't for health or mania. It was as if the taste was an unnecessary nuisance. In front of him, Tomas tried to hold the conversation with the tweezers of everyday life. The weather, the prices, the neighbor who had fallen on the stairs. But each word of his slipped in the air as if it had nowhere to fall. Life as it was had become as fragile as a wet cloth. Everything was in its place. Yes. The cups were always the half-dead plants on the windowsill, the sepia portraits that hung like still ghosts on the wall, and yet something had changed. Not outside, but inside, something in the way Elias looked at him or avoided looking at him. As if the father's eyes no longer saw the son, but rather an uncomfortable witness. Tomas remembered childhood as an album without music. His mother, Clara, had died young. A sudden stroke, they said. He left no letters, no will, no farewells. Just a tidy kitchen and a perfume in the air that lasted a few more days. Since then, Elias had been locked like a safe without a combination. But now, with each passing day, the past seemed to peek through the cracks. And he did it with a gentle, almost elegant cruelty. A comment thrown into the void, "You don't know everything that happened," a phrase said, like someone who drops a glass and doesn't bother to pick up the pieces. There were things that didn't add up. The upstairs room, for example, closed since Tomas was 12 years old. His mother had died a year earlier. His father had said that it flooded, that there were mushrooms. But Tomas remembered a different night in which voices and knocks were heard. Then silence. One afternoon, while Elias was taking a nap with his head tilted towards the back of the chair, Tomas went upstairs. Each step creaked with the timidity of old secrets. The new lock shone boldly, as if unaware that its very existence was a provocation. He went down without making a sound. He pretended that nothing fazed him, but that night he couldn't sleep. He dreamed of his mother. Not as she was, but as he remembered her in his nightmares. On her back. Always on her back, as if something or someone prevented her from turning around. The next day brought a gentle fog. Tomas went to the hardware store and bought a set of lockpicks that he ordered like someone buying nails. He hid them in the pocket of his coat, the same one he used in the winters of college. When he still believed that the truth was something to be found by reading, that night he waited for his father to fall asleep. He went up again, more slowly this time, with his pulse contained and his breathing low. He opened the door in silence, feeling how time stopped or went backwards. Inside the room, the air smelled of confinement, of aged paper. And then he saw it, a wooden box, carefully wrapped in an old blanket, with an inscription burned into it. It wasn't his name, it wasn't his mother's. It was another. The box was full of letters, all addressed to Clara. None signed by Elias. The letters were elegant. It's black ink, paper from another time. They did not have an exact date, but they spoke. From a past that still breathed. The calligraphy was firm, almost ceremonial. It was not Elias' handwriting, nor his tone. These words came from another voice, a masculine, intimate, hurt voice, which spoke to Clara like someone who has loved urgently and lost slowly. Tomas read them one after the other, sitting on the floor, with the old blanket as his only cover, and the ceiling lamp swinging barely. There was something sacred in that gloom, something he didn't dare break from his thoughts. Clara, I don't know if this will be the last time I write to you, but if Elias reads one of these letters again, I fear for you. Since that night at the lake house, you are no longer the same. He knows it. So do I, but only one of the three dares to name it. Remember, you're not crazy. He's desperate to keep his world intact. The sender's name never appeared, only one initial at the bottom of each letter, Faf, written with force, as if she wanted to leave a mark on the paper, on history, on Clara. Tomas felt something cold settle in his chest, as if childhood had slipped from his bones. It wasn't just the betrayal that shook him, but the idea that his entire life, everything he had thought he understood about his parents, about his family, could have been a meticulous set piece constructed to hide something he was never allowed to see. He went downstairs without taking the letters, left them there in the same order. Elias was still asleep, or pretending to be. The television cast blue flashes over his face, giving him a ghostly expression. Tomas watched him from the door frame. For a moment, she wanted to wake him up. I wanted to shout at him, but he didn't do it. Because something about that sleeping face, that thin skin like rice paper, that mouth half open, as if it still held words that didn't dare come out, reminded him of a child. A lonely child. A child who perhaps had also been afraid. Days passed without Tomas mentioning anything. He walked through the house as if each step activated an echo that came from another time. He remembered things that didn't seem important before. His mother crying in the bathroom with the door ajar. His father talking on the phone with a low, dry voice. An argument in the middle of the night that he had assumed was a bad dream. One night, he couldn't take it anymore. He made tea and sat in front of his father. Dad, he said, like someone who invokes something, without knowing if he wants it to appear. Who is F? Elias did not respond immediately. He continued stirring the sugar in his cup, as if the spoon was searching for a bottom that didn't exist. Finally, he looked up, and he didn't say, I don't know. He didn't say, what are you taking about? He said, you shouldn't have read that. That know the letters, know the lies, know the past. Alone that Tomas felt a strange vertigo, not because of evasion, but for the certainty that his father knew exactly what he had read, and that, far from denying it, he carried it like someone carrying a cross too familiar to let go. Silence. That was the real protagonist of that night. Silence that was no longer uncomfortable. It was absolute, dense, like the air before a storm. Tomas went to sleep with a phrase stuck in the back of his neck without his father saying it out loud, but which floated in the air like a formless threat. Don't ask any more, because I haven't finished forgiving myself either. Since that conversation in the kitchen, if it could be called that, something inside Tomas began to unravel. It wasn't an explosion, or a scream, or a scene. It was like a crack that runs inside a vessel, while on the outside everything remains intact. He continued living in the same house, making the same coffee, listening to the same shuffling footsteps of his father in the morning. But he was no longer the same. He avoided the room upstairs as if the air there had become unbreathable. He didn't touch the cards again, not because he didn't want to, but because he already knew the damage was done. What hurt was not the betrayal itself, but the idea that her mother, the purest, most distant, most luminous figure, had lived trapped between two men, one of whom had posed as a guard. Being a jailer, he spent more time in the neighborhood square, sitting on a bench that creaked under his weight. Sometimes I just watched the children running. The dogs chasing each other senselessly, the mothers distracted by their cell phones. But there was one detail that began to repeat itself. A girl of no more than 8 years old was watching him. From afar. Always from the same corner. Always with a notebook in his hands. The first time he thought it was a coincidence. The second, that he mistook him for someone. The third time, he no longer doubted it. He was drawing it. He approached. Out of curiosity rather than impulse. What are you doing? He asked with a voice that sounded softer than expected to himself. I draw you, said the girl, without stopping moving the pencil. You have the face of a sad statue, Tomas let out a laugh that was more of a sigh. He sat next to her without asking permission, looked at the drawing. Clumsy but honest lines. There he was, with his gray coat and his melancholic expression. The girl was not talented yet, but she had something that many adults had lost: the ability to see what is. Your name? He asked. Mara. And you? Thomas. And why are you so sad, Tomas? The question was not offensive. She was sincere. A question that was not looking for answers, but for company. From that day on, Mara became a constant appearance. Not every day, but enough. Sometimes she drew, sometimes she just talked about unimportant things. A fight at school, a stray cat. That followed her, a dream where she was flying with balloons. But there was something about her presence, her innocence untouched by drama. Her lightness in the face of the weight of the world that worked like a slow bomb. Tomas did not talk to him about his father, nor from his mother, not even the letters. But he did tell her stories, made-up tales, disguised metaphors, fragments of a life he seemed not to have lived. On one of those afternoons, while the sun was hiding between the buildings, he said, "Sometimes, adults hide things because they believe they are protecting others. But sometimes what they do is put a blindfold so strong that it blinds us forever." Mara looked at him with those enormous eyes that listened to everything, even what was not said. "And you? Have you taken off the blindfold yet?" Tomas didn't know what to answer. He returned home with the feeling that that girl, without knowing it, had given him a key. Not to open a door, but to accept that there was a closed door, and that perhaps it always would be. But he could walk just the same, with the lock on his back. Even if he never found the complete key. That night, his father asked him if he wanted to have dinner. Tomas said no without looking up. Elias nodded his head as if he was not expecting another response. After he locked himself in his room, Tomas returned to the hallway. He looked at the door to the forbidden room like someone looking at an open tomb. He didn't touch her. Not this time. But something had changed. He was no longer so afraid of the echo that came out of there. Mara had taught him something without. Knowing it, that even sad statues crack, and through those cracks, sometimes light sneaks in, truly important actions. Those that are born from the soul and not from impulse rarely come with a bang. They slide, like a breeze that barely moves the curtains, but changes the entire air of a room. That's how Tomas started to move. There was no plan, there was no firm resolution, just a small gesture. He took out of the drawer an old notebook where his mother used to write down recipes. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, but she needed to touch something that had belonged only to her. He found it between tablecloths, wrinkled with oil stains and faded words. And on the first page, written in blue ink and fast handwriting, a sentence: "There are things that are only understood when the heart is tired of being silent." Tomas closed the notebook and pressed it to his chest. He didn't cry, but something inside him broke silently, as if he had finally heard a long-forgotten whisper. The following days, he passed through the square again. But when she received him as one would receive intimate acquaintances, without unnecessary words. Sometimes she drew without looking at him. Other times, he just sat next to her in silence. That silent habit, so different from the chaos he had inside, became a refuge. One afternoon, Tomas diverted his path and approached an old bakery. One of those that still smells of flour and firewood, where time seems to have stopped. He entered. Not out of hunger, but out of memory. There, his mother used to take him on Saturdays, and she always bought him the same flower-shaped cookie. The woman at the counter was different, but the layout of the place remained the same. Tomas asked for one of those cookies. When he tasted it, he knew that memory has flavor. And it hurts. Later, he stopped by the public library. He was searching, without admitting it, for records of the past. Old newspapers, minutes, traces. Not the sender of the letters that Guy F. seemed to have vanished in the smoke of history, but from his mother. Letters to the editor, published recipes, even school records from his childhood. I wanted to reconstruct it from other eyes. He didn't find much, except for a mention in a neighborhood newsletter from almost 30 years ago, Clara Olmos, organizer of the autumn fair. It was little, but enough to remind himself that his mother had had a life of her own. Outside of the secret triangle that suffocated them, returning home, he turned off onto a side street. There lived Arminda, a friend of her mother, one of those who always seemed to have the answer to what was not asked. They hadn't seen each other since the funeral. Tomas hesitated in front of the door. Then he played. The woman opened slowly. His face was worn, but his eyes were intact, 2 coals that were still burning. "I knew you were going to come someday," he said, as if they had agreed on that. "Happens." Thomas entered. He didn't say much, neither does Arminda. But after a shared tea and a long silence, she placed a small box on the table. "Your mother asked me to give it to you, if you ever needed it." He didn't ask what it meant. He just opened the box. Inside, he found a photo. It was old, but clear. Clara was sitting on a bench, young, smiling, and aside, a man who was not Elias. There was nothing compromising about the image. It's just a closeness that said more than 1,000 letters. "Who is it?" Tomas asked. "A man who wanted to do things right but was late," Arminda said. Like almost all the men in this story, he didn't say more. It wasn't necessary. That night, Tomas came home with the box under his arm. Elias was sleeping in front of the television again, as if the present couldn't touch him. Tomas passed in front of him like a shadow. He stopped for a moment, looked at it, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel hate, felt compassion. She saw him as a man trapped in his own lies. An old soldier who, after years of combat, had forgotten why he was fighting. He went up the stairs. He entered the room. He took out the cards, placed the photo on top, and he waited. Not an answer, just the next step. Time is a silent animal. Walk among objects, among customs, among forgotten words. But sometimes it stops, crouches in a random corner in old tape. An unopened box and waits to be touched before roaring again. Tomas found the tape by accident. I wasn't looking for it. I was cleaning the attic, a space that for years had been kept closed off as a sanctuary from dust. He moved nameless boxes, removed cobwebs with an absent gesture, more out of physical necessity than emotional intention, until a heavier than expected box slipped by a mistake. When he opened it, he found no documents, no photos, no old clothes. Just a cassette recorder and a tape marked with 2 initials, C.O. It was as if an invisible current ran through his chest. The tape was intact. Recorder, somewhat damaged, still had batteries. He hesitated. Then he pressed play. The voice that emerged was his mother's. It's not as he remembered her in recent years when the illness took her breath away, but with force. Lara spoke slowly, like someone who leaves a will without knowing. If anyone will ever hear it, it wasn't addressed to him. He spoke to a nameless recipient, the tenderness and anguish that only those who have loved with guilt can hold in their throats. It was a recorded confession, a thread of words full of nostalgia, unhealed wounds, half-made decisions. It spoke of a love that was born without permission, of brief afternoons that seemed eternal, of the impossibility of abandoning a husband who needed her more out of fear than love, from a son who should not find out because his childhood deserved to be cleaner than the life that surrounded him. But he also talked about weight of sacrifice, of the nights looking at the ceiling, imagining a different life, and, above all, of Elias's silent betrayal, not for having found out, but for having remained silent, for using that silence as a gag, for turning someone else's fault into a tool of control. Tomas listened to everything without moving. He felt his mother's voice traversing decades to reach him, not with justifications, but with a truth that hurt more because it came too late. When the recording ended, he didn't cry. I couldn't, it stayed there, the final whir of the tape filling the room like a trapped fly. The image he had of his mother was no longer the same, nor his father's. The entire board of the past had turned, and he, without meaning to, was standing in the middle of the pieces. He came back down with the recorder in his hand. He didn't say anything to Elias. He just watched him for a few minutes while the old man cut bread, as if everything was still the same. But in Tomas' eyes, there was no longer fury or confusion. There was a different wound, that of someone who discovers that everything they believed to be true was only a part of the whole. That night, he didn't sleep, not because of insomnia, but for conscience. He wondered if he had ever really listened to his mother, if he had seen beyond his role, if he had been unfair in his idealized memory. And above all, if he was willing to accept that the woman he had loved so much had also lead, not with cruelty, but with a tenderness that he now understood had been his way of surviving. He remembered one day in particular, when he was a child, Clara had burned a letter in the backyard. He watched her from the window without understanding. She noticed it, but didn't say anything. She only smiled at him with a sadness so subtle that he then mistook it for calm. Now I understood everything. The letter had to be from the same man as the others. Or maybe it was a response never sent. It doesn't matter. That burning had been a ritual, the attempt to erase a part of herself to save what little she had left standing. An intimate renunciation, sacrifice without witnesses. The next morning, Tomas looked in the mirror and did not recognize himself. But not because he was old or dejected, but because for the first time in years, he didn't know exactly who he was, and that uncertainty, instead of scaring him, offered him a strange freedom. Finally, he was no longer just the son of Clara or Elias. He was beginning to be someone who could observe the wound. Without becoming it, old houses have their own language. They creak when something is not said. They sigh when memories weigh too much. Elias's was no exception. In the days after the revelation, the air thickened, not from heat or dust, but from what floated between the two men. A different silence, almost alive, that dragged through the corridors like an uncomfortable witness. Tomas had tried to take the first step, not with words, but with small gestures. He prepared the coffee at the exact time his father drank it. He ordered the workshop tools without being asked. He took the old bicycle that his father had stored after a fall from the garage and inflated the tires, although he knew that Elias had no intention of using it anymore. He didn't do it out of routine or duty. He did it looking for something. Some clue, some crack in that rough figure that had been his father for so long. But Elijah remained Hermenegene. Not because of coldness, but because of an ancient way of defending oneself, getting involved in routine as in a trench. He read the newspaper, listened to the radio, watered the plants with a delicacy that seemed almost cruel because of its indifference. I wasn't asking. I didn't comment. It offered no bridges. Tomas tried to reconnect with him like someone trying to translate a language he has forgotten to speak. Everything he had discovered continued to chew inside him like ground glass. The tape. The confession. Clara's face saying names he had never heard. But I needed to understand. Not for justice, but for meaning. They sat one afternoon in the patio. It was one of those moments where everything seems conjured for a dialogue. The warm light, the noiseless air, the chairs facing each other. And yet the words did not come. They just looked at each other. And in that look, they said everything they couldn't articulate. Tomas, inside, wanted an explanation. Not so much about what his mother had done, but about what Elijah didn't do. About the prolonged silence, about the decision to hide from him not only the truth, but also the opportunity to build his own version of it. But Elias offered nothing, not because of evil. Maybe out of fear, maybe because of shame, maybe simply because I didn't know how. Because he had spent so many years swallowing the past that he no longer knew how to spit it out without choking. One morning, Tomas went for a walk. He returned. To the neighborhood where he had grown up, the houses had changed. Some painted in new colors, others sold, others collapsed. His was still standing, although with other owners, went and healed. He walked aimlessly until he reached the park where he used to play. As a child, on the bench at the back, where his mother used to wait for him with a thermos of tea, he sat down. There was no one. The silence of the park spoke to him more than his father. It was there that he remembered something he had forgotten. One afternoon, when he was very little, Clara asked him not to repeat something in front of Elias. A name. A surname. At that moment, he didn't understand. He just nodded, thinking he was helping in some game. Now I understood. Even he had been part of the pact of silence, without knowing it. He returned home without saying a word. That night he passed his father in the hallway. For a moment they both stopped, a pause that lasted as long as a lifetime contained in one breath. There were no recriminations, no hugs, no crying. Only the precise distance between two men marked by the same woman, by the same lies, by the same silences. Tomas locked himself in his room, took out the recorder and the tape. He didn't hear her again. It was no longer necessary. What I was looking for was not to repeat the pain, but to understand if there was still something to rescue. The only thing he found was an old notebook. It belonged to Clara. In it there were recipes, pencil drawings, notes of common days, Thursday, rain, lentils, and homemade bread. Tomas dreamed of elephants. It was a domestic diary. But among its pages, hidden as if it feared being read, was a folded paper with an address and a date. Nothing else. Tomas put it in his pocket. Without knowing why, he felt that another search began there. One that had nothing to do with forgiving or accusing, but with understanding what lay beyond the story they told him. And maybe, just maybe, that would bring him closer to his father, even if he didn't know how to receive him. Life, Tomas thought, sometimes disguises itself as repetition. The days are identical, almost scheduled, the same coffee at the same hours, the same steps when returning home, the same memories that fade when you look directly at them. It didn't seem like anything was going to change, not even his father's silence, not even Clara's shadow, not even the weight he carried without knowing how to let go. But life has a funny way of throwing something at us at the least expected moment, to force us to look ahead, even if we don't want to. It was a normal morning when it happened. Tomas was in the garden, kneeling on the land that he did not cultivate, but that he felt was his, with hands full of dirt, as if he were going to do more than a simple task. The address he had found in Clara's notebook was still there in his jacket pocket, as a reminder that there was something unresolved, something that rightfully belonged to him, but that he still couldn't understand. The letter remained an enigma, one of those that remained floating, suspended, waiting for an answer. Suddenly, he heard the sound of the front gate opening. He looked down the street and saw his father walking slowly, carrying a wooden box. Wasn't something Elias normally did? That time he was always in his workshop, isolated in his world, but this time there was no rush, no automatic gestures. He walked with an unusual stillness, as if he didn't want time to pass too quickly. He approached Tomas without saying anything, but stared at him as he placed the box on the floor in front of him. Tomas stood up from the ground, bewildered, but at the same time, a pang of anticipation ran down his spine. It was the same silence as always, but with something added, something different. Elias crouched down slowly and began to untie a loop of rope that held the box. He didn't rush. He didn't want to rush. Tomas, at first reluctant, observed without asking questions. I knew something important was brewing. In that moment, something that didn't need words, the box was finally opened. Inside, wrapped in a threadbare cloth, was an antique clock, one that Tomas had once seen in his mother's house, a watch that Clara had loved, and that had been one of the few possessions of sentimental value that she jealously guarded. Elias looked at him without smiling, but his eyes, those eyes that always seemed to be beyond everything, seemed calmer than ever, as if somehow he had made peace with himself. Tomas, not completely understanding, touched the watch with trembling fingers. She remembered her mother telling her stories about that watch, how she had received it as a gift, how time had stopped for her in that moment. It was the only object in his life that had survived the passing of the years. The moves, the losses. Elias, without saying a word, placed the box between the two, as if everything he had done throughout his life could now be explained in that simple gesture. The ticking clock seemed to fill the void between them. There were no shouts, no accusations, no promises. Just that ticking, slow and constant, as if time finally gave them the chance to redeem what was left. Tomas, with a heavy heart, leaned towards the clock, observing the glass, the wear and tear of the years. Clara's memory of the days when she smiled at him as she told him the stories of her childhood rose like a ghost before him. And somehow, Tomas understood that what he had been looking for was not the explanation for the betrayal, nor the justice he had waited for so long. What he needed, what he could no longer avoid, was to accept. He had failed to. Not just his mother, but himself. He had assumed that his suffering and his search for answers would be enough to heal what had been destroyed. But her father's gift, the simple return of a beloved object, was a symbol of something greater. The opportunity to see love and pain as inseparable parts of her story. Not as enemies to be destroyed, Elias stood up, concluding his gesture. Offered no words, no promises. The clock was still there between them, but something had changed. The density of the air was no longer the same. Tomas looked at him. There was neither absolute love nor excessive hatred, just a subtle acceptance. It was a small step forward. And although the future was unclear, for the first time in a long time, Tomas allowed himself to feel that there was something to move forward with. Something that needed no explanations, no justifications, not even forgiveness. The clock began to ring, one of those small echoes of the past, as the sun slid gently over the horizon. Time, Tomas thought, doesn't stop. Even if you want it to. Although one wants to freeze certain moments to be able to digest them, to be able to see them in a different light, but it doesn't. Time continues to advance, inexorable. And, like a river that never stops flowing, it drags with it what it can, what it leaves behind. What escapes without one noticing. Thus began the real recovery. Not with a grandiose act or a cry of victory, not with loud hugs or cathartic tears. It began in silence, like everything that really matters, like everything that really lasts. The small corner of the soul where one finds oneself, in a place as forgotten as the dust that accumulates on old books, Tomas had begun to see his life with new eyes. Not as a drama that needed to be resolved, but as a story that needed to be understood. His mother's revelation, his father's gesture, the pieces of the puzzle that never fit together, were now taking shape. They were fragments of a narrative that I couldn't change, but that I could reinterpret. Elijah's house remained the same. The hallways, the rooms, the walls full of old photographs, which no longer seemed to carry the weight of the past. The table where Clara had written letters and made plans. The armchair where Elias had rested for years, not knowing how to face the life he had created around him. Everything was still there, but something about him had changed. Not in the structure, but in the way Tomas saw it. The reconciliation, in some ways, had already begun long before he himself understood it. It was neither a great forgiveness nor an act of monumental generosity. It was a slow thaw. It was being able to accept that what had happened could no longer be erased. But that pain did not have to define everything either. Tomas began to work in the workshop, without hurry, without expectations. It was his place now, even though it had never been. His father, in his imperturbable routine, did not interrupt him. Sometimes they passed each other in silence, but it was no longer the same silence as before. There was something peaceful about him, as if the space between them was no longer filled with reproach, but with tacit understanding, an understanding that did not require words. One afternoon, Tomas decided to take the watch to the workshop. He placed it on the work table next to the tools. It was not an act of confrontation nor of disdain. He just left it there, like someone placing a symbol of his life. Something that had been absent and that now occupied a tangible place. As if by putting him in that space, he had claimed his right to remember without resentment Elias passed. By without stopping. But he looked at the clock. He didn't comment, but something in his eyes changed. It was as if that small, silent object had done more for him than any word he could ever utter. Tomas didn't expect anything. I didn't want answers or drastic changes. The truth was that I didn't need it. But what I had learned, or rather what I was beginning to understand, was that the truth didn't have to be a tell-all letter or a dramatic discovery. The truth was in the gestures and the silences, in the stillness of everyday life. In those moments when one faces one's own reflection, without judgment, just with acceptance of what has been, peace did not come like a torrent, but like a gentle tide that little by little calmed the turbulent waters of his soul. There was no explosive forgiveness or cathartic revelations. There was simply a slow fading of the shadows. A silent recognition that what had happened, as painful as it was, had also been a part of who they were. And that did not have to define them. Tomas went out into the garden and sat in the old wooden chair that his mother had used. He looked at the horizon, as if there he could see the future that in some way he had already begun to build without. Knowing it was not a great future, nor one full of promise. It was just a future where, for the first time, the word sun didn't have to be filled with broken expectations. The sun was beginning to set, but the light was still there, sliding over the ground, painting the leaves slowly falling from the trees in gold. Everything seemed, for a moment, in its place. Not perfect. Just in place, and Tomas, for the first time in a long time, did not feel the need to flee. Tomas's hands, covered in oil and wood dust, began to move with quiet familiarity. He was in his father's workshop, surrounded by old tools and memories that slipped between the corners as if the house itself had kept them for him. The space was full of history, but also of silences. The same silences that he had learned to tolerate, to understand. While adjusting the frame of an old chair that he had decided to restore, something on the floor caught his attention. A small box, almost forgotten, hidden under a pile of papers. And yet, the tie that kept it closed was the same one he had used in his youth to keep letters or small souvenirs. Curious. Tomas picked up the box and opened it, revealing an aged envelope with his name written in ink. The handwriting was his, but he didn't remember having written it. At first, he felt a strange chill run down his spine. The envelope contained a letter, carefully folded, written years ago, when he was a young man full of hope, but also doubts. At that time, he had decided to do something for his father, something that had not been big or especially significant to the world, but to him. The letter talked about her decision to help Elias, without him knowing it. With money she had saved from her first job, Tomas had believed at that time that the gesture would be a relief for his father, something that would ease the tension accumulated over the years, but he never said anything to her. The letter was written and put away, and the money disappeared as if it had never existed. In that moment, I guess his fingers brushed the faded ink of the letter. Tomas understood. That gesture, that small sacrifice he made for his father, had been one of those invisible acts that define lives without anyone knowing. He had acted without expecting anything in return, without anyone recognizing his sacrifice. He had done it because, deep down, he felt it was the right thing to do. An attempt to redeem the irremediable. The letter was a testimony to a forgotten action, an attempt to repair a broken relationship in a way as silent as his own pain. But the moment he found her, Tomas understood that that gesture had already returned, but in a way he had not anticipated. The money he had secretly sent was not only a relief to his father at the time, but now it was revealed to be a seed that had grown unexpectedly. Elias had never mentioned it, but somehow that silent act had changed the dynamic between them. No matter how small, leave traces that we do not always see in the moment, but that are found in the simplest gestures. Looking up at the workshop, Tomas felt a slight comfort. The act of giving, although unrecognized and unremembered, was what had finally begun to restore balance to his life. Suddenly he understood that many times the most significant actions do not require applause. They slip through time, return, without warning, and when we least expect it. He didn't need any more words. He had already found what he was looking for. The certainty that his life and his relationship with his father was not defined by what he had lost, but by what, although invisible, had endured over time. And as he got up to continue his work, he couldn't help but think that, in the end, forgiveness and redemption sometimes don't come loudly, but rather slip silently by, like the passage of time that never stops moving. Whether we notice it or not, the Day lengthened like a sigh suspended in the air. Tomas, without haste, walked through the hallways of the family home, his steps heavy but determined. In his hands, he held a letter he had found by accident, almost like a sign. It wasn't just any letter, but one that her mother had written. Years ago, the days when she still believed that words could heal everything that was broken, the letter had never been delivered. It had remained stored in a closed drawer, forgotten among other things from the past. But today it seemed to have a silent urgency, a purpose that I didn't fully understand. As he walked, his mind was filled with images of the past. The arguments, the heavy silences, the unspoken lies. The figure of his father, who had always been an enigma, seemed to have gained weight over the years, obscured by secrets that not even he could fully understand. When he arrived at the living room, found Elias in his usual place by the window. The old man stood still, looking outside without seeming to notice his presence. The years had transformed him, making him more fragile, but also, somehow, more present. It was as if the man who had once been the unbreakable pillar of his life was now subjected to the same passage of time that had marked everyone around him. Tomas stood there, in the doorway, not knowing whether he should approach or retreat. The words, although present in his mind, seemed too small for the moment in which they lived. There was no resentment, no desire for revenge. There was only a deep need to understand, to break through the invisible wall that had been erected. Between them over the years, Elias did not turn around when he heard her footsteps. The letter in Tomas' hands seemed to be weighed down by the gravity of the past. He knew that Elias had lived his entire life with a lie on his back, a betrayal that had marked his family forever, but he also knew that that same lie had made him who he was, no matter how much he hated that truth. Tomas, in silence, approached the table where his father used to write. Without a word, he placed the letter in front of him, not seeking a nod of approval, simply leaving it there, as if words could fill the void between them. The letter was not an accusation. It was not a declaration of war. It was just an answer that Tomas had had to write for himself, no matter how much it was for his mother, no matter how much it was for his father. It was the last piece of a puzzle that seemed to have no solution, but that, somehow, had to be completed. Elias looked at the letter for a long moment, as if he were evaluating its contents without actually reading it. The man's face, marked by years in guilt, showed no signs of surprise or regret. But there was something in his posture that, for the first time, seemed willing to listen without immediately responding. Silence became his response. A few minutes passed, in which Tomas began to feel ridiculous for having looked for answers on a piece of paper that he could no longer give them. It was like trying to revive a story that had already been written, something that there was no longer any point in questioning. But the silence between them, however, didn't seem as distant as before. It was a silence full of questions, of unexpressed pain, but also of tacit acceptance. Elijah finally looked up, his eyes, once hard and sometimes filled with inexplicable anger, were now softened, as if a veil of understanding had covered them. It was as if, after so long, something inside him had fallen into place. There were no words of apology, no grand revelation. Only the calm of someone who has been dragged by the weight of time and now faces it with a new perspective. Tomas took a deep breath, recognizing that the reconciliation, although undeclared, had already begun. At that point, I no longer needed a big reveal or a definitive conclusion. Peace does not come with complete answers, he thought, but with the acceptance that some things cannot be solved. But that doesn't mean they can't be understood. Elias left the letter on the table without looking at it again. What had been left in the air, what really mattered, was the presence of his son. But as the father who had tried in his own way to support him, and although the pain did not completely dissipate, although the shadows of the past were still there, at least for the first time in a long time, they did not feel so heavy. Tomas, without saying a word, turned on his heel and left the room. Elijah did not follow him, but he did not stop him either. He knew that this step, the first in so long, was all he could hope for. Sometimes the answers aren't found in the big conversations. Sometimes they are in shared silences, in small gestures that require nothing more than being present. Time, as always, moved forward with the same cadence, relentless and patient, dragging with it both the weight of the past and unfulfilled promises. However, for Tomas, the hours seemed to have softened. There was no longer a pressing calendar that marked the moments of confrontation or the inevitable conflicts. Life was now slipping by with a tranquility I had not known in years. And although it was not a definitive calm, far from it, there was something about the stillness of recent days that offered a respite. His relationship with Elias, although still marked by echoes of the past, was beginning to acquire a new rhythm. He was not the same as before, nor would he ever be. Pain no longer dominated his thoughts, nor did anger rise like an unstoppable tide. What remained between them was somehow more authentic, more human, a silent respect, a mutual recognition that they were both imperfect, but enough to be there. For each other, without a word of apology or a promise of redemption, Tomas was beginning to see himself differently. Over the years, she had carried a heavy backpack, the pain of betrayal, the feeling of abandonment, the fear that love would never be enough. But little by little, those memories began to dissolve, like fog under the sun. He no longer saw them as part of himself, but as footprints on the road. A path that he now walked more lightly, as if each step took him closer to a truth that, although not absolute, was more bearable. Elias, for his part, had also changed. Not in the sense that he had transformed into another being, far from it. There were no miracles, no sudden epiphanies. But the simple fact that he, for the first time in a long time, had allowed Tomas to approach him without rejecting him, without the weight of an unresolved history between them, was in itself a profound change. The house, in its silence and stillness, now reflected a type of coexistence that was no longer just tolerance, but a kind of mutual acceptance of the broken parts. Peace did not come with fanfare, nor with definitive resolutions. Process, as smooth as the passing of the seasons, which made no noise when it was installed. But in that silence, Tomas began to understand that, at last, he had found a kind of reconciliation. Not with the history he had lived, but with who he was now. He no longer carried on his shoulders the need to give answers, to find a logic that justified everything that had happened. He no longer expected that his father could change the past, or that he himself could erase the scars on his soul. As the days passed, the light coming through the windows, the murmur of the wind through the trees, the smell of the coffee that Elias prepared every morning, everything seemed to be imbued with a peace that, for a time, had seemed unattainable. And although the shadows of the past were still present, they were no longer the same. They no longer dominated, they no longer controlled. There was something in the air that whispered to him that everything could move forward without needing to have all the answers. Tomas, as time went by, stopped carrying the weight of the wise. He let go of the constant thought of how things should have been, of whether forgiveness had come too late. Instead, he allowed life to flow as it was, with its imperfections, with its moments of doubt and its moments of clarity. And through it all, love, the same love that was once just a distant refuge, slowly settled into his heart. A love that did not need to be perfect nor justified. A love that simply existed because that was life itself, imperfect, but full of moments worth living in the afternoons. As he watched Elias sitting in his armchair, Tomas felt that the relationship they shared was no longer based on what they had lost, but on what they could now build, even if it was in silence. There were no grand gestures, no raucous celebrations, just the tacit knowledge that in the end, they had found each other again. And in that finding, there was peace. He looked toward the future, not knowing exactly what it would hold, but for the first time, without the paralyzing fear of uncertainty, he knew he couldn't change what had happened. But I also knew that what was yet to come could be different even in its simplicity. And that, he thought, was enough. Time, as always, continued its march, slowly but surely. While the lives of those who had been touched by the passing of the years were transformed, almost without realizing it. Tomas, although now distant from the weight of unresolved questions, understood that the legacy he left was not a simple material inheritance, but something much deeper, more subtle. It was the mark left on those who still walked after him, the influence that, no matter how small, marked the course of those who would come after him, Elias had started writing, something he had not done for years. A letter, a simple letter, but one that carried with it the weight of everything that had never been said. In it, there were no great confessions, nor painful regrets. No, it was a simple letter, loaded with that wisdom that only the years can grant, a recognition of what was experienced, what was lost, and above all, what had been learned along the way. The letter was not meant to change the past, but to provide closure. Something that would finally allow the wounds to heal, although without completely disappearing. He handed it to his son, without ceremony, without applause, only with the certainty that this gesture, no matter how simple it was, would be enough for Tomas to finally understand the weight of what they had both experienced. Outside, in the garden, Tomas's granddaughter, a restless young woman, looked at Elias's old chair, the same one that had witnessed so many wordless conversations, so many heavy silences. Today, however, the young woman had returned, driven by something she could not identify. She had long been a distant observer, someone who had barely understood the complexities of what was happening between her father and grandfather. But at that moment, seeing that empty chair, something inside her woke up. A long sigh, a small gesture of sadness, perhaps for everything that had not been said before, for all the unspoken words between generations, but also, perhaps, because of the understanding that the stories of the elders do not always have a clear conclusion, but they are always full of lessons to be learned. Tomas watched her from the window. Something had changed in her, sparkle, in his eyes that wasn't there before. He knew that future generations, even if they did not understand all the nuances, would carry with them the traces of what had happened. And those footprints, although distant, would continue to shape the stories to come. He might never fully understand the impact of what had happened, but he understood it enough to know that his legacy, however imperfect, was being passed on. There was something in that letter from Elijah that could not be seen with the naked eye, a small change in the way his words were received. Tomas felt that, finally, something had deeply penetrated his daughter, something that had been lost over the years. Perhaps it was a silent understanding, a tacit acceptance that life doesn't always have easy answers. But it does have room for forgiveness and growth. The old love that was once so complicated, so full of misunderstandings, was beginning to resurface in the little things. In the smile that Elias, for the first time in a long time, gave Tomas, without burden, without resentment. Just a smile that said everything that couldn't be said in words. It was the kind of gesture that Tomas had been waiting for years, even if he didn't know it. And although the smile did not resolve all the years of wounds, it was enough to understand that. In the end, love is never completely lost, even if it sometimes transforms and takes unexpected forms. Meanwhile, life continued. The granddaughter, like her mother and grandfather, would learn from this legacy in her own way, perhaps more slowly, but with the same depth. No one could predict how all this would play out in the future, but Tomas felt that at least there was one thing he could be sure of. He had given something of himself, something that could not be taken away by circumstance or the passage of time. Outside, the wind continued its course. The leaves of the trees fell as they always had, with a calm and serene cadence. And although the past, with all its betrayals and mistakes, remained marked in their hearts, so did the possibility of something new, something better, that could never be completely erased. In Thomas's heart, the legacy of that truth, the simple but powerful truth that life, no matter how difficult, kept going, kept living, was the greatest of gifts. The sun was beginning to go down, turning gold into the garden that Tomas had cared for so many years. The soft colors of the afternoon were reflected in the falling leaves, without haste, as if each of them had its own time. Stillness was palpable, and yet the air carried with it a slight, almost imperceptible vibration of everything that had been experienced. Tomas was standing next to a small wooden table, his figure slightly hunched, his hands wrinkled and weathered by the passage of time. In front of him, a plant, which had been forgotten for a long time, received the caresses of his watering. His fingers, slow but sure, worked with the calm of someone who no longer expects anything rushed. Of someone who has learned that what is cultivated with patience, even if late, always bears fruit. With each drop of water, the plant seemed to revive, as if it too were part of that untold story. A story that had never been told in a simple way, but that now found a small corner of peace. The earth absorbed the water with a softness that felt like a whisper, a relief that didn't need to be expressed, only experienced in a nearby corner. Thomas' granddaughter passed by, watching from a distance, without making a sound. Shone with something that Thomas couldn't identify, but that he felt. Something that was part of everything that had happened, part of the softness that time had begun to give them. She smiled. A small, silent smile, but it was like a ray of sunlight that filtered through the shadows. There were no big words to accompany that gesture. It was just a smile, but there was an unspoken recognition in it, something Thomas couldn't fully understand, that somehow he knew was enough. Thomas didn't say anything. There was no need for words. As he continued his task, his gaze was lost in the plant, in the earth, in that simple but profound act. Everything was fine somehow. Not perfect, but good. The wind continued its course, gently caressing the branches of the trees. Thomas, with one last movement, put the watering can down, stood up, and took a step back. His eyes, fixed on the plant, on the garden he had tended, and on the life he had lived, softened. It was not a look of resignation, but of acceptance. The camera slowly moves away, leaving behind the figure of Thomas, now calmer. While the afternoon slowly dies on the horizon, in that space of silence where the shadows begin to lengthen, there is no definitive resolution. There is no answer to all questions. It's just the softness of the moment, the feeling that in the end, everything continues. And just like that, story dissolves, like water seeping into the earth.